Good afternoon. My name is Immaculata DeVivo. I'm the other co-director for Faculty for Science Programming here at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I will take you through the discussion and Q&A, and I would invite Kimberly and Angela to join me. And I want to remind everyone at home and in the audience or virtually to send your questions using the Slido link. And I can tell you that our speakers have caused quite a buzz because lots of questions are coming in. I hope I can get my questions. So I will lead the Q&A and then come back to do some closing remarks and remind everyone to please go and view the students' posters downstairs. Okay, so if I may address you all by your first name, and you can address me by Mac. Okay, great. So I have a lot of my own questions, but I would be remiss not to ask some of the questions that are coming in from our audience and from the in-person and our virtual, because they're pretty good. So some of them are targeted for our speakers, and some of them are clear from the topic that I can ask. So for Angela, you got a great compliment, and I will start just because you're also closest to me. Great talk. What explains why the previous climate models were contradictory?
Yeah, so in terms of precipitation, like relative to temperature, it's actually really hard to model in a climate model. Precipitation's highly localized. It depends on lots of different climate variables, and a lot of the processes that actually make it rain are happening at very small scales in a cloud, and our climate models are representing processes at a very coarse spatial scale. So it's just hard to capture those physical processes in climate models. And so that leads to, different climate models having different changes in rainfall. And that's because different climate model groups are actually built by different teams of scientists. And the way they represent rain in their climate model structurally is different and involves different parameterizations, different conditions, and so that just leads to different amounts of rainfall depending on how the model is built.
Right, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's variable.
Yeah, and there's a lot of smart people trying to reduce that uncertainty and come up with new ways to make it rain in these climate models that better represent reality. So I think there's a lot of initiatives to reduce the uncertainty.
Are there efforts to collect ground-based data in Madagascar?
Yes, there are, but there are, to get these, to understand how rainfall is changing over long periods of time, we need long records that are consistent. And so even if you take a weather station and you move it a kilometer away, that move can have an effect on the time series. And so we need long-term measurements to get a sense of how rainfall is changing. But there are efforts in Madagascar, specifically with my collaborators, to collect data to collect survey data. So looking at food production, to look at how the yields of the farms, and to get more agricultural data on the ground in concert with meteorological data. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff going on in terms of collecting data too.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to move on, otherwise I could spend the whole afternoon talking about Madagascar.
Thank you, Mac.
So, Kimberly, are we seeing conflicts over fish in the U.S.?
Yes. So we have seen some lawsuits issued already by states in the north asking for more quota from these stocks that are moving up from the south. So the example I gave of black sea bass and summer flounder, about 50% of the quota or more is concentrated in Virginia and North Carolina. The stock is now off the shore of Connecticut most of the time. So fishers want in. And we're also seeing conflict between the U.S. and Canada. As our stocks are moving across the border, there has been some physical jostling between some of the boats out there on lobster.
So I think your talk, as well as Angela, stimulated a question by a colleague of mine. The pace of change is such that adaptation needs to happen during the lifetime of a single generation. How can this pace be best managed?
It's really challenging, especially because when you think about how public policy works, its job is to stabilize. That's very hard when you have systems that are moving very quickly and you need to vote on something. So some things the councils have looked at are creating these predetermined triggers with science that once this happens, it triggers the requirement to come up with a plan within a certain amount of time. Some people still argue it's not fast enough, though.
Right.
And that's one of the things they're looking into in the next reauthorization of the law is how can we create more nimble systems?
Yes. Divya, if I may? Yep. Question for you. What's the mechanism for how short-term migration assists in climate adaptation? That's the first part of the question. And then I'll ask you the second part, yeah?
So you can see that short-term migration, we find that households that generally don't have access to a lot of resources, when their agricultural yield fails in that particular season itself, short-term migration is something that's available to them to give them enough of an income so that they don't have to reduce consumption to a great deal. So that way it really ensures food security for the household. And in that way it's also, because it's not the best option, but sometimes it's the only option available, and it can help the household.
Yes, and the second part of that was, is it just about labor, or is there other mechanisms?
So it's labor, but of course it's also remittances that is coming back from the migrant. Sometimes migrants will send back money while they're while they're in their destination area. Sometimes they'll bring back money, so that that influx of financial capital at those critical moments is really important.
So I had a question. So how can emerging sustainable farming methods help farmers adapt to the impacts of the climate change?
So one of the other branches of research I look at is sustainable intensification, which is really important because it can help build resilient natural resource bases. So when you're thinking about something like conservation agriculture, it can increase micronutrients in the soil, and this is really valuable for adaptation. And on the other hand, you also have these methods which can increase yield, leading to farmers not having to react in the same way using distress migration, and they can use more economic forms of migration, so leading to a positive feedback loops between migration and adaptation.
Yes, and I want to ask this question because I think, and I probably will defer to Nikki to answer this given your recent work in policy, but it's something that all of you probably can address, which is how would you advise non-experts gain the data literacy needed to understand what can be confusing news media landscape around climate change impacts?
I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a wild west out there when it comes to reading things in the news. And there's a lot of vested interests that are trying to create false narratives to change people's behavior and the way that we vote. I'm sure that, you've come across fake news before. So it's very much the case in the climate world and with food and agriculture as well. So the way that I do it is I just try and read a range of sources. I've got preferred outlets as well. I've got ones that I feel a little bit more trustworthy to me. I also like deferring to the scientists out there as they're less likely to be biased, although not always. Just read a lot, question everything. And I'm sure that there are things that you might read that, you may think perhaps this is too good to be true, and you may well realize that, your gut is correct. Just be suspicious of everything is my answer.
And to follow up on that, to what degree, and I know the answer to this because I have a pet peeve about this, is this idea of reductionism a problem, where everyone wants to really, I know being reductive is alluring, and no one has time to read sometimes beyond headlines. But how much responsibility does that bear on all this false news or...
A lot. And it's not just journalists that love a reductionist approach. Working with the government, they also very much like a simple solution as well, usually. And when you try and add nuance, then they put their fingers in their ears and go, la, la, I'm not listening. So it can be really difficult to convey complexity to the general public, to the media, and to policymakers. And I think there is quite a special skill in being able to convey that nuance and that complexity in a way that doesn't bore people or just confuse them senseless. So I would say that trying to find a way to communicate that is something that perhaps universities and wherever you're working, you really should be adding skills in those communication skills, because, yeah, it's just so important, isn't it, Mag?
It is, and I think we can start by conveying that two things can be true, you know, in a way to relay some information. One more question, well, before I do another round. So what way, Nikki, did the Danish tax affect the economy negatively?
What way? Sorry, can you repeat
In
that?
what way did the Danish tax affect the economy negatively?
Oh, just because of the reduction in the meat sales, and particularly for the farmers, that it was affecting that basically. That then rolled over onto the amount that supermarkets were getting, and in high-end restaurants that were selling kind of less healthy meat, that it was kind of a large-scale effect, basically.
I see. I have a question, Kimberly. So in addition to climate change, how do you find issues like chemical contamination, such as PFAS in our waterways, impacting our fisheries?
There is a lot of new research that's coming out on the toxicology of fish, because they do bioaccumulate. In other words, they tend to store these toxicities in their tissues, and then when they get consumed by other fish up the chain, they consume that as well, and then we eat that. And there's also a lot of a big open question as to how the increase in marine plastics might be affecting what fish eat and what we ultimately eat. And I think that's actually a new area of research that could potentially become even larger than climate change in the oceans. Some people are really starting to address these issues. But there are some techniques, like I've seen oyster farms in Delaware, where I'm from, where they actually, after they farm the oyster, they go take it out into the ocean to let enough of basically its droppings come out to reduce the toxicity levels in it before they sell it to consumers, so that they aren't consuming that. So they are trying to create some techniques, at least in the aquaculture space, of certain animals that we can reduce toxicity levels before we sell them.
So essentially, like, give them a big bath to dilute the
Or
contaminant?
give them enough time to empty their system.
I see. I think we know.
Without any more new inputs, yep.
So Angela, there was a question that came in for you, but I will go on. So do you have plans to apply similar methods to different regions?
Yeah, we are actually working on we've been digging into the physical processes that are causing shifts in rainfall kind of over Madagascar and Southern Africa, and we have plans to basically look and see in these regions, using similar data, do we see similar shifts in the rainfall that we'd expect based on these large-scale shifts in the atmospheric motions. And then hopefully we're going to go in and actually see if we see this in the food production data. A lot of places that don't have rainfall records also don't have great records of food production, but I think that when I attack a problem like this, when there's not a lot of in situ data, I kind of look at this like almost like a puzzle, and we have a lot of remote sensing data, and we have some in situ data, and I think it kind of gets to this reductionist of not being a reductionist and really looking at the details. And in these places with limited in situ data, I think we need to, as scientists, like dig into the details and really dig into the data we have to get an answer to the question. So yeah, we're expanding it regionally and hope to really still keep this narrow focus on the details, though.
Great. Another question for you is, curious whether Angela has considered behavioral interventions grounded in the clear prescriptions that emerge from her data.
I like in terms of adaptations, like farmer adaptations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm working with other experts to come up with these. Myself as a hydrologist, and I've put together, I think I've been learning about agriculture, learning about climate dynamics. I have a great team of people who are helping me bring together these different disciplines, and I think translating this to actual behavioral adaptation is important. I think Kimberly brought up the loss and damage fund, and that's actually kind of applicable when thinking about a country like Madagascar, because here's a country that hasn't contributed much to emissions, but yet it's going to see the impacts of climate change. And so, yeah, they're going to need to adapt. How they're going to do it, who's going to pay for it, is a question that's in discussion.
Right.
So, yeah.
Divya, how does migration impact the future food security of countries in South Asia?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like I was saying, in some regions in Nepal, you see that farmers are just leaving their fields, so there isn't much agriculture happening because of migration. But oftentimes you see that those two processes kind of co-evolve. So farmers leave agriculture because yields are decreasing and because of the impacts of climate change. So I think it's really important to, when thinking about this, is to think in two different ways in terms of how do you increase yields, how do you make farming systems more resilient, and in that way you'd be helping food security in the local region. Another important part of this question is that migration is also leading to increasing participation of women in agricultural systems, and this can also be an opportunity to increase food security, because if you can provide women enough access to resources, access to agricultural extension services, you can actually see increases in food security in origins.
Related, but not a total follow-up, are there methane reduction strategies in South Asia?
Yeah, so there are different sustainable intensification technologies. You have direct seeding of rice, where you don't flood fields, and that reduces methane. And thinking about, there's also carbon emission reductions, which you can have through zero tillage technology. So there are a lot of new technologies that can lead to reductions in emissions as well.
Great. So Nikki, of course, your talk was very optimistic, and someone in our either audience or virtual audience agrees that it was super powerful. The question is, thoughts about how to reconcile veganism with low-cost protein diet in the global South?
Well, just to say, I'm not advocating for a vegan diet, and meat is essential, particularly in developing countries, to add essential nutrients, and it can really help particularly reduce child stunting, help with even people's intelligence throughout school. So it is essential. I'm not saying don't have it, but there are cheap ways in which you can integrate more plants into your diet, and this can be very beneficial for your health as well. I spent much of my time in my 20s living in Africa, in poor rural regions, and I was really surprised when I went into supermarkets that there are lots of accidentally vegan options there, where it's usually kind of like dried soy mince that you see everywhere. People are buying it because they can't afford meat. So there definitely are plant-based alternatives. It's high in protein. It may not have all of the nutrients that you would get in, say, a beef steak, but there definitely are alternatives out there. But I'm sure trying to add a little bit, particularly of dairy, into the diet as well will help ensure nutrition in these developing countries.
Right, and you did not advocate for one or the other. You did say small changes will make a big difference. So Kimberly, question for you. How does offshore drilling affect toxicity in our fish?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm not sure if I'm the expert to answer that. I mean, most of what I've heard about in terms of the conflict between offshore drilling and fishers are really who's going to use the space more. And it's not just with offshore drilling, but also with future wind farm siting. There's a lot of conflict because whenever you have equipment out there and a boat drags their trawl net over it and could damage it, there's liability. So there's a lot of conflict right now between the space and the ocean, because we're starting to use a lot more of it, between the fishing community and other resource extraction that we're doing. But I actually am not the expert on drilling and toxicity of fish, so I'm probably going to have to ask a friend about that.
Yeah, is there a friend that want to, right, a lifeline, right? What was that show? I can't remember either. So this is a question any of you can take, I guess. How do you share your research with industry so they can incorporate your findings? Anyone? Angela?
I probably have the least innovation here. How do I share it with industries? I've been mostly publishing peer-reviewed articles, which is not what people want to hear. I'm an academic, and that's my primary outlet. Giving talks like this
Right.
to spread to spread it, but I don't have any secret to get it to industry right now. I don't
Nikki,
know
you
if
had your hand up?
Yeah.
We do a lot of engagement with lots of different stakeholders at the Climate Change Committee, and we actually see that as vital to building trust and to ensuring that what we're doing is right, and that, I guess there's a big risk of just being sat in an office with a bunch of climate nerds like myself stuck on Excel, that you can lose track of the wider picture just by looking at spreadsheets and things. So it's so important to go out there and speak to a whole range of different stakeholders like industry, because, as I said in my talk, to solve the climate crisis, we need to work in partnership. We need everyone along for the ride. And industry is such an important part of that. So just last week, with my chair, we were meeting with one of our farming partners to try and get their thoughts on some of the work that we've got coming up and to listen to their concerns as well. So I would definitely say that it's absolutely essential for us to continue doing that.
Yes, Kimberly.
So I'm working on a blue crab project right now with fishers in Delaware. And not only do we really rely on the fishers to provide us the samples of the crab that we need to dissect, we're looking at productivity changes as well as how many are consuming microplastics. But when we're considering solutions of how might we maybe alter the crab season, we have to talk to them about what's going to affect their costs the most, or what might even be beneficial for them. So we try to get a sense of when they're fishing, what gear they're putting out, when and why they're catching males versus females, and what sizes, what market price they're getting, who they're competing with, and is there a way we can kind of insert a little bit of policy to maintain the stock without any economic damages on them. So we do work really hand in hand with them when we can to try to understand. We go fishing with them, literally, how they think about when they harvest and why.
Right. So, Divya, back to you. There's a question. How can emerging sustainable farming methods help farmers adapt to the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, and this is keeping sustainable intensification at the cornerstone, but thinking about climate-smart agricultural technologies is really important, where you're incentivizing farmers to switch to, say, cropping methods that mitigate, but also help to build the resource base and can help them adapt in the future. In addition to that, you also see new sustainable technologies is going to play a big role in how future climatic events, especially when you're thinking about floods and droughts, it's going to mediate how our food security is going to be impacted by these.
Great. There's another question for you, Nikki. I'm sorry, I lost it, but I'll get back to it. There is a question for you, Angela, on Madagascar. How is Madagascar adapting to the shortened growing season?
Yeah, I mean, right now I would say there's not an adaptation strategy to deal with the fact that the rainy season will be delayed. And so this is ongoing, coming up with this sort of strategy. I think, there are options.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the options could be to focus on crops that have a shorter period for maturation, and that will kind of provide relief, because during the end of the growing season is that it's called the lean season. It's the season where they're waiting. It's a time when people are waiting for harvests, and so a delay in the onset means that this lean season is basically delayed too. So kind of reducing that by choosing varieties that have a shorter maturation period could be an effective adaptation.
So do they have, I'm sure, oral history, do you know from being there and working with folks, you know where I'm going with this question, like an oral history of past?
I know. So there's going to be this survey that they're going to ask people, and that's a question I want on the survey, is how has the rainy season onset changed? And I know that people's perceptions might not reflect reality, but I think that the onset of rains is a pretty tangible thing. It's not rains more or less, it's the onset. And so I'm hoping to include a question like that in an actual survey.
Yeah, I would think you would remember like a very dry season
Yeah.
versus not like as we say, not the day-to-day, but the trends. So
Yeah.
that would be interesting to see
I
how
think
people
so,
have
too.
adapted.
I think so. I agree completely. I think it would be really cool to get that data.
So Dr. Rust, Nikki, I go back to you. I found it. Wondering what the CCC is advising the UK government regarding policies to mitigate food waste. Oh, and by the way, great presentation.
Thanks. If that was my dad, then thanks. He has been watching. We do a lot to advise the UK government on food waste from farm to fork. In the UK, a lot of the food waste comes from once you've purchased it. Unfortunately, we buy lots of things and then we don't eat it, and then it goes in the bin, and when food breaks down, it also produces methane, which, as I mentioned, is a really potent greenhouse gas. So there are lots of things that we are suggesting, all the way from how it's grown on a farm up to when consumers purchase it. But it could be as simple as things like working out what you need for the entire week and ensuring you don't get caught into those buy one, get one free deals, which I am very guilty of doing. I love a good bargain, but if you have bought too many bell peppers or something like that and you're seeing them sat in your fridge, then have a think about, could I make some soup with this, and then I could freeze some of it, or think of other ways that you can preserve it. There are lots of things that you can do to help conserve the amount of food that you're wasting.
Yes, and a related, but not exactly the same question, I'm going to ask Kimberly. What's the most friendly fish? I'm assuming from a climate sustainability point of view.
Do you like jellyfish? We're going to have a lot of them in the future. So that might be one of them. But anything local is always good if you can. One of the biggest problems in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is if we have to not only boat the boat way out to catch it, so if you're catching a highly migratory species like tuna, that's a lot of fuel you're using up, but also if that's going to a market in Japan to be sold on airplane, on ice, and then flying back to you in the United States, which often happens. We'll catch something in the US, fly it all the way to Japan, sell it, fly it all the way back here to eat it. That's a lot of carbon emissions. So if you can get something from your local fisher, if you're lucky enough to live by the coast, then that's always a great thing to do.
Yes. Divya, is there much cross-border farm labor migration between India, Nepal, and Bangladesh?
So there is a fair amount, I would say, especially from Nepal to India. That's also because of border restrictions are much lesser between Nepal and India. But there is a large increase in the amount of farm labor migration, mainly because there are many more opportunities in urban and peri-urban areas that provide more incomes and rather than farm labor. And also farm labor, again, is susceptible to weather events. So when you're sending a household member to migrate to generate income because your farm income is already insecure, you want them to go to somewhere you know that they'll get a more secure income, so that might not always be in the agricultural space in another country.
So you mentioned during your talk that Nepal, migration pattern is different from India and Bangladesh. Nepal go out of the country. So where do they typically go?
So a lot of migrants will go to the Middle East, and now increasingly Southeast Asia. South Asia has always been there just because of the spatial proximity, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. So Nikki, I think this question is also for you. Do meat, dairy-free alternatives sometimes pose just as much as a negative impact? For example, faux meat made from soy.
There is often this perception that soy is responsible for deforestation in South America, and whilst it does contribute, the main source of deforestation is cattle ranching. And usually it's sort of free-range cattle ranching, which is fed on grass, and it's only then, once the cattle have been on there for a little while, do they then change it to soybean production. So actually almost, or I'm just trying to think off the top of my head of a plant-based alternative that has higher emissions, and I can't really think of one. There was a fantastic paper by Poor and Niminchek in 2018, I think, in Science, that looked into the environmental emissions of lots of different food sources. And one of the main findings was plant-based alternatives have lower land use, lower water use, lower greenhouse gas emissions. So in general, usually much better. There are certain differences. I think like almonds grown in California have a very high water use, but in general, usually the plant options are environmentally better across the board.
Yes, so there's some general questions that are coming in that I think any one of you can respond. So would carbon credits on agricultural soils, for example, help mitigate or prevent food crisis in the future?
So I can speak a little to
Yes.
that. So there have been a lot of these emerging projects and linked to climate smart agriculture, where you're trying to incentivize farmers to adopt technologies which can help keep carbon in the soil. But the problem is when you're talking about smallholder systems, how do you measure the carbon? It's a big problem actually measuring how much carbon you can sequester through these technologies, and it might not be financially feasible. So there have been scientists who are looking at remote sensing ways to actually measure carbon in soil, but we haven't gotten to that point where it is easy to apply this at a landscape level. So until we get to that point, it's still, I think, a work in progress.
It's a work in progress. And there's actually another question for you related to the migration. Are the farmers really migrating because of changes in climate, or there's just too many farmers in the family that can earn more money in the city or abroad?
I think it's a combination of the two. It's definitely not just climate change that is driving migration. In a lot of these places, these migration patterns already exist, but climate is playing an important role in influencing how people are migrating and when people are migrating.
Right.
Like I mentioned, economic migration patterns are often quite different from distress migration patterns. So you can see that when it's a short-term climate shock, people choose to migrate to places where they might not make as much money. So it's not really an economic decision, but in the case of longer-term migration to urban areas, usually it is for wealth accumulation, but again, it depends on the household itself. Households require a certain amount of, you need a certain amount of capital to be able to invest in a certain type of migration that can help you build economic assets. So I guess it depends on what the household already has, as well as the risks that the household faces.
Very good answer. So the general question, here's the other one. These presentations all show a need to reduce emissions, consumption, and overfishing. How do we reconcile this with a need to produce increasing amounts of food? So Kimberly, you can limit that to fish in this case.
Sure. We actually just passed the threshold for aquaculture. So I mostly talked about wild marine capture, but aquaculture is now producing as much seafood as wild marine capture. So that's a new threshold. The U.S. is actually pretty slow to the game in aquaculture. We don't allow for a lot of it here, but there's a lot of research being done on shellfish and seaweed is actually an interesting solution not just for getting more seed products, but also potentially reducing methane in some cows as feed. So there's some integration here between the two systems.
You know, I'm happy you brought up seaweed because in discussions with some colleagues, we've been talking about seaweed as a nutrition source or supplements. Can you speak a little bit about that?
It's a great nutrition source. The concept of sequestering carbon too with just more primary reduction from the ocean is there. It can be done very locally if you're by the shore. I think a lot of people are interested in it. The challenge is with anything, how do you get a large enough production chain going? This is very true in thinking about it as feed for livestock. Just how they do their feed, it's a very big problem. How would we get seafood processed close enough to a farm and integrate it into their feed? So there's a lot of logistical challenges.
But I would assume that since the seaweed is growing in the same water and where the fish are swimming, that they're going to be also susceptible to contamination. Or is it a different system of uptaking the contaminants?
So there's seaweed being produced in many ways, some in situ, some inside buildings entirely.
Like farming, like if you can farm seaweed.
Yeah, so it depends on the system.
Oh, great. A question for you, Nikki. You mentioned that many Western countries overconsume red meat. Does overconsuming red meat have negative health effects?
It does, particularly when it comes to processed meat, so things like burgers and sausages and bacon. There's been many studies that have shown that it can increase your chance of lots of different types of cancer, heart disease, stroke, lots of things. There's also some evidence, although it's a little bit less certain, that over-consuming certain red meats can be damaging to your health as well. And lots of Western countries do currently over-consume meat. And one of the effects that has is because of meat is so high in protein. It's one of the reasons why we suggest eating meat, because it's very high in protein. But if you eat too much protein, then it's also bad for you. So it can negatively affect your kidney function and your heart as well. In the UK, the recommended daily allowance is 70 grams. I don't know what that is in pounds and ounces, but it's not a great deal. So if you stick to the recommended daily allowance, then hopefully you shouldn't be over-consuming and causing those negative effects.
And why do you think heads of state are not willing to do anything about shifting their citizens to a more sustainable diets?
It's very political, and I think most governments don't want to be seen to be telling people what they should and shouldn't eat, particularly when it comes to meat. In the UK, we brought in a sugar tax, and actually that was very well accepted. People thought, brilliant, yes, particularly children very susceptible to obesity by drinking these high sugar content drinks, and so that was across the board accepted. But it seems anything to do with meat is not seen as acceptable at all. So I think politicians just don't want to risk losing the next general election, unfortunately.
And unfortunately, this will be the last question, and it's related. So what's the one thing you'd recommend to policymakers to help improve the situation?
Who's that to?
That's to you, Nikki, sorry.
Sorry. Well, I would say just look at the data, look at the science on the effects of over-consuming meat on our health, on the environment. Like, this is a triple win. It's rare in policy that you find such a triple win. That if we can start reducing levels of meat and dairy consumption to the recommended daily levels, we'll save on our health bills, we'll save on the effects, on trying to combat climate change, we'll save on biodiversity loss. It really is a triple win. So let's just grab the bull by the horns and go with it.
I don't know how I could follow that up, but thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Divya, Kimberly, and Angela. If you want to take your seats in the audience, I'll just have a few closing remarks. Thank you so much. And of course, my closing remarks are on the table. So many papers to manage. So a couple of closing remarks, because we've said it all, both from the speakers and from the panel here. So in keeping with my style of what are the scope of the issues, so water management, fisheries, we have macro wars, Southern Asia extreme weather impacts farming, and food scarcity, of course, and then how do we have farming adaptation, and the balancing of the fisheries with economy. And so the good news from Kimberly is that policy is working. And that is always very an optimistic message to say that we're not just stuck. We can legislate, we can have policies work for us. And so I'd like to thank Kimberly for giving me the opportunity to end on an optimistic note. And with that, I'd like to remind everyone again about the poster session downstairs from our students. And it's the first floor of Knaufel. And I'd like to thank everyone, thank Ido, thank Becky, thank all the speakers for coming, traveling, thank all the people at home or virtually, people in the audience, thank our dean for always supporting us, and to thank the Salata Institute for allowing us to be part of their big Harvard Climate Action Week. And I'd like you to know that recordings of today's program will be posted in the coming weeks on the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu, where viewers can also find listings of past and future Radcliffe events, including many of the related to the climate change. And thank you all again for joining us today, whether you are here in the audience or attending online, and take care.